The sun was burning over the small western town, throwing long shadows across the dry ground. Dust rolled through the air, and horses snorted and wagons creaked. Daniel, a quiet rancher in his 30s, rode into town on his old brown horse, planning only to buy supplies. He wasn't the kind of man who liked crowds. People in town knew him as the man who worked alone, the one who had lost his family to sickness years ago. He spoke little, smiled less, and spent most of his time with his horses and cattle far out on the land. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The smell of tobacco, dry flour, and leather filled the air. As he gathered rope and tools, he heard a voice calling from the street, loud, rough, and sharp. Curiosity made him walk outside. A small crowd had gathered near the old wooden platform used for trading. Daniel pushed through a few men and saw what had drawn everyone's attention. On the stage stood a woman, tall, proud, and silent. Her hands were bound in front of her, and her clothes were torn and dusty. Her skin was warm copper. Her hair, long and dark, was braided loosely over her shoulder. Her eyes didn't move, but her face showed quiet strength. The man beside her, dressed in worn military clothes, was shouting to the crowd. Captured Apache woman, strong, young, good worker, sold by order. His tone was rough, as if he was calling out livestock instead of a person. Daniel felt something twist inside his chest. The crowd murmured and laughed. Some men looked at her as if she were a thing, not human. One threw a coin on the ground and said something that made others snicker. The woman didn't react. She kept her eyes fixed far away, almost as if she was looking beyond all of them. The auctioneer started calling prices. $20, $25. The voices came slowly but not serious. Most men were just teasing. Daniel didn't know what made him speak, but before he realized it, his voice came out clear. 30. The crowd turned. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow and called again. 30. Silence. No one else spoke. Daniel said 40. The auctioneer slammed his hand down and shouted, "Sold!" The sound hit Daniel's ears like thunder. He didn't move at first. He hadn't meant to actually buy her. He just couldn't stand the thought of her being treated like property. The men laughed as the soldier shoved the woman toward him, handing over a paper. "She's yours now," the man said coldly. Daniel gave him the money and untied her hands gently. For the first time, she looked directly at him, steady and silent. Her gaze was strong enough to make him forget what to say. They walked to his horse together. People in town stared, whispering as he passed. A few women crossed their arms, judging him, but Daniel didn't meet their eyes. He lifted the woman up on the horse first, then climbed behind her. As they rode out of town, she stayed straight-backed, not leaning, not speaking. The wind blew dust across the trail as the town disappeared behind them. His ranch lay miles away past rocky hills and open plains. The ride was long and quiet. Daniel tried to speak once or twice, asking her name, if she was hungry, but she didn't answer. He didn't press. When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the mountains. The sky burned orange and gold. Daniel helped her down from the horse and led her toward the small cabin he'd built with his own hands. It wasn't much. One room, a small barn, a porch with a broken chair, but it was clean and strong. He opened the door for her. "You can rest here," he said softly. She stepped inside and stood near the wall, her eyes scanning the room. The old table, the rough bed, the iron stove. Daniel went to the kitchen corner, poured some water, and handed it to her. She took it carefully and drank. He made stew from the little he had, beans and meat, and placed a bowl in front of her. She looked at it for a moment, then sat down slowly and began to eat. Her movements were quiet and respectful, as if she didn't want to take more than needed. When she finished, she looked at him and finally spoke, her voice low but clear. "Why did you buy me?" The question caught him off guard. He set down his spoon and said, "Because they were treating you wrong. No one deserves that." She nodded once, her eyes unreadable. Then she said softly, "You bought me anyway. That means I'm yours now." Daniel shook his head quickly. "No, you're free here. You can stay tonight. Eat, rest. Tomorrow you can go wherever you want." She stared at him for a long moment. "No one buys freedom," she whispered. The words hit him deep. She turned toward the window, looking out at the darkening fields. The night wind moved her hair, and the silence grew thick between them. Daniel couldn't find anything to say after that. He went outside to sit on the porch, listening to the horses in the corral. Hours passed, The stars came out, bright and endless, in the clear desert sky. Daniel leaned back and thought about what she'd said. He had never seen anyone stand so proud after such humiliation. Something about her reminded him of the life he used to have, simple, honest, and full of meaning before loneliness swallowed it. Inside, the woman quietly cleaned the dishes and folded the blanket he had given her. When Daniel walked back in, she was sitting by the fire staring into the flames. He asked again, "What's your name?" She hesitated, then answered, "Ayana?" He repeated it softly, letting the sound settle in the room. She looked at him, then at the small carving of a horse on the shelf. "You live alone?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, for a long time now." They didn't talk much after that. He gave her the bed and slept in the chair near the door. The fire burned low, throwing a soft orange glow on the walls. In the quiet, he could hear her breathing, steady, calm. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. At dawn, Daniel woke to the sound of movement. When he stepped outside, he saw Ayana near the barn, feeding the horses with handfuls of hay. She was barefoot, her hair loose, her dress torn, but neat. The early light touched her face gently. Daniel stood for a moment, just watching. She moved with confidence, like she had always belonged among animals and open land. He walked up to her and said, "You don't have to work." She looked at him with calm eyes. "I know," she said simply, "but I don't want to sit and do nothing." Then she turned back to the horses, brushing one gently on the neck. Daniel smiled quietly. There was strength in her that words couldn't describe. That morning, as the sun rose higher, Daniel felt something new, a strange peace he hadn't known in years. The house no longer felt empty. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Buying her had changed everything. Not because he wanted to own her, but because he finally saw life returning to a place that had been silent for far too long. And deep down, though he didn't say it out loud, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The morning air was cool and a thin mist hung above the fields. Daniel stepped out of his cabin, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The first thing he saw was Ayana near the well, pulling up a bucket of water with strong, steady arms. Her hair was loose, shining in the pale light. She looked up when she noticed him watching, but didn't speak. She carried the water toward the house as if she had done it all her life. Daniel followed quietly, feeling unsure of what to say. Inside, she had already swept the floor and cleaned the small table. The cabin looked brighter, lighter somehow. Daniel sat down and she poured him water in a tin cup. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded and turned toward the stove. He noticed she had found some dried meat and beans and was already cooking breakfast. The smell filled the room. Warm and simple. As they ate, Daniel tried again to talk. "You slept well?" he asked. She gave a small nod. "Yes." He hesitated, then asked, "You plan to go somewhere?" She stopped eating, looked at him, and said calmly, "I don't know." "Where would I go?" Her tone wasn't bitter, just empty, quiet. Daniel didn't have an answer. After a pause, he said, "You don't have to leave right away. You can stay until you decide." Ayana looked down at her bowl, then back at him. "You think I'm afraid to go?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, I just think you've been through enough." She didn't reply, but her eyes softened a little. She went back to eating in silence. After breakfast, Daniel went to the corral to check on the horses. He was surprised to find that Ayana was already there, mending a broken fence rail. She used a hammer and nails from the shed, working carefully. Daniel walked up beside her. "You don't need to do all that," he said. She didn't stop working. "If I stay here, I work." "That's fair," she said simply. He couldn't argue with that. Together they worked through the morning, fixing the fences and cleaning the stalls. Daniel found himself watching her more than working. She didn't complain once, even when the sun grew hot. She moved quietly, her steps light on the dry ground, her hands sure and skilled. She seemed to understand animals. The horses calmed around her. Even the wild one that usually snapped and kicked stayed still as she brushed its neck. At noon, they sat in the shade by the barn. Daniel offered her water, and she accepted it with a small smile. "You've worked hard," he said. "You could rest." She wiped sweat from her forehead and said, "Work keeps the heart strong." Her words made him think of his own life, how work had been his only companion for years. But seeing her work was different. It didn't feel lonely anymore. Later in the day, Daniel brought her an old dress that had belonged to his late wife. It had been packed away for years in a wooden chest. He felt strange holding it again. "You might need this," he said, handing it to her. She looked at it quietly and touched the fabric, tracing the edge with her fingers. Your wife? She asked. Daniel nodded. She passed years ago. Ayana folded the dress gently in her hands and said softly, I will take care of it. That evening, they sat by the fire again. Daniel cooked and Ayana mended a torn saddle strap. The room felt warm, filled with the small sounds of firewood crackling and tools moving. When they finished eating, Daniel leaned back and looked at her. You don't talk much, he said with a faint smile. She looked at him calmly. Talking too much brings trouble, she said, and listening tells more truth. Her answer made him laugh quietly. That's true, he agreed. For the first time, her lips curved into a faint smile. After a long silence, Daniel spoke again. You said something last night, that no one buys freedom. I've been thinking about that. She looked into the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. Because it's true, she said softly. A person's freedom is not something to be traded. Once someone pays for it, it's no longer real. Daniel nodded slowly. Then maybe I didn't buy yours. Maybe I just paid to stop someone else from hurting you. Ayana turned to him, her face unreadable for a moment. Then why bring me here? She asked. Daniel hesitated. I don't know, he admitted honestly. Maybe because I didn't want to see you taken away like that. Maybe because I know what it's like to lose everything. The fire crackled softly between them. Ayana looked at him, really looked. Not with suspicion, but with quiet understanding. What did you lose? She asked. Daniel stared into the fire for a long time before answering. My wife and my son. Fever took them both one winter. Since then, I just kept working, easier than remembering. Ayana's expression softened. She looked down at her hands, then said quietly, I lost my family too. Soldiers came to our village. My father fought, my mother hid me, but they found us. I ran for days before I was caught. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes were heavy with memories. Daniel didn't speak. He knew that kind of pain didn't need answers, just silence that understood. After a while, she said, when they brought me to town, I thought I would die there, but then you came. Daniel looked up at her, surprised. She continued, you didn't look at me the way they did. You looked like someone who had seen too much sorrow. Her tone wasn't soft or romantic, just honest. I knew you wouldn't hurt me. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. For years, he had lived without anyone's trust, without anyone's eyes meeting his like that. He nodded quietly. You're safe here, he said. They sat in silence again, listening to the wind outside. The night was cold, but neither of them moved closer to the fire. There was a strange peace in the air, not comfort exactly, but understanding. Before going to sleep, Daniel placed another blanket by the bed and said, tomorrow I'll take you into town if you want. You can decide what to do. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, I'll think. When he woke the next morning, Ayana was already outside again. She had milked the cow, fed the chickens, and was carrying water to the garden. Daniel watched from the porch, quietly amazed. She worked like she belonged there. Every movement had purpose. When she noticed him watching, she said, your field has weeds. They're taking the water. He smiled. You sound like you've been running a ranch all your life. She shrugged lightly. Work is the same everywhere. The earth always answers those who care for it. As the day passed, the rhythm of their lives began to settle. Daniel worked beside her, showing her how to stack hay and fix the gate latch. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not. But silence no longer felt heavy. It was comfortable. That evening, clouds rolled in and rain began to fall, the first in weeks. They stood under the porch roof, watching the sky turn silver. Ayana held out her hands to feel the rain and smiled faintly. It was the first real smile Daniel had seen from her. The earth remembers kindness, she said softly. He looked at her, wanting to ask what she meant, but she turned away, her hair wet and shining under the rainlight. When night came, Daniel sat by the fire again. Ayana was sitting across from him, brushing her hair dry. The soft light made her face calm and thoughtful. He realized he hadn't felt so peaceful in years. Something had changed quietly between them, not because of words, but because of how they existed in the same space, working and surviving together before sleeping. Ayana looked up and said, you are not like other men I've seen. You treat me like I'm already free. Daniel met her gaze. That's because you are, he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes deep and searching. Then she nodded once and turned toward the fire. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He watched the flames flicker, thinking about the strange turn his life had taken, How a single moment of kindness at an auction had brought another heartbeat into his lonely world. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing clearly. For the first time in years, his house no longer felt empty, and his heart didn't feel hollow. Ayana's presence had brought life back into the quiet ranch, and neither of them yet knew how deeply their paths were beginning to entwine. The sun had begun to rise again over the ranch, painting everything in golden orange. Daniel stepped outside, hearing the soft sounds of work already being done. Ayana was near the fence, feeding the horses and checking the water troughs. She moved like she had always belonged there. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a quiet respect that grew each day. She was not like anyone he had ever met. She carried her pain like a secret, yet her spirit seemed stronger than the dry land itself. As days turned into weeks, the silence between them began to soften. Ayana would now greet him in the mornings with a small nod, sometimes even a faint smile. She had learned to use his tools, fix the hinges on the barn door, and even cook bread over the old stove. Her presence brought a rhythm back to the lonely ranch, a calm order that Daniel hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Daniel found her sitting on the fence, staring at the distant hills. He noticed her hands were rough and scratched from work, yet she didn't seem to mind. "You miss your home?" he asked quietly. She didn't turn to him at first. Then she said, "There is no home now. My people are gone." Her words were steady, but her eyes told another story, one of loss that went deeper than words. Daniel sat beside her, resting his hands on his knees. "I'm sorry," he said. Ayana looked at him. "You didn't do it," she replied, "but you care. That's something rare." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Ayana began to tell her story in pieces. She spoke quietly, her voice almost blending with the wind. "When they came to our village, my father told us to run. My mother hid me behind rocks. I heard shouting, then silence. I went back after 2 days, but there was nothing left. Then men found me and took me away. They said I was worth something. I stopped speaking after that." Daniel sat still, listening to every word. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had always believed life on the frontier was hard for everyone, but he had never imagined such cruelty. When she finished, he said softly, "You're not worth something to be bought. You're worth something because you're you." Ayana looked at him strangely, almost studying him as if trying to see if he truly meant it. Then she said, "You speak like someone who lost something too." Daniel nodded. He told her about his wife, Mary, who had fallen sick one winter, and their small son, who didn't survive the fever that followed. His voice broke slightly as he spoke. For the first time, Ayana reached out and touched his arm. "Pain is the same for everyone," she said gently, "but how we carry it makes us who we are." That night, the sky was clear and full of stars. Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat outside thinking about what she had said. There was a strange comfort in knowing that someone else understood the kind of silence that came after loss. From that night on, they began to speak more. Not much, but enough. Small conversations about weather, animals, food, and sometimes about memories. The next morning, Daniel rode into town for supplies. When he returned, he found Ayana waiting by the barn, a worried look on her face. "You were gone long," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Just a few hours." She crossed her arms. It felt longer. Her voice was calm, but her concern was clear. Daniel felt something warm spread through him. He had lived for years without anyone waiting for him. And now, for the first time, someone did. That evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled and rain beat hard on the roof. Daniel went outside to secure the animals, but Ayana followed him holding a lantern. "You should stay inside," he said. She shook her head. "I've lived through worse storms." They worked together, pulling in the horses, covering the feed, and tying down the barn door. Rain soaked through their clothes and thunder rolled across the sky. By the time they got back inside, they were both drenched and breathless. Daniel started a fire to warm them. Ayana sat near it, her hair dripping, her face lit by the flames. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "You should have left me in town." Daniel frowned. "Why would I?" She looked up, her eyes serious. "Because I bring danger. People don't like seeing us together. They will talk." Daniel shook his head. "Let them talk. I don't care." She stared at him, searching for a lie, but there was none. After a while, she said, "You're not afraid of them." Daniel looked into the fire. "I've been alone too long to fear people's words." Ayana nodded slowly. "Then you are braver than most." The next few days, the storm passed, leaving the land washed clean and green. Ayana began planting small patches of corn and herbs near the cabin. Daniel helped her, though she clearly knew more about the earth than he did. "You have gentle hands," she said one morning as he tried to plant seeds carefully. "They're rough from work," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Gentle doesn't mean soft. It means you don't hurt what doesn't need hurting." Her words stayed with him all day. One afternoon, a trader came from town. A man Daniel sometimes dealt with. He stopped near the gate and called out, "Heard you got company, Daniel. An Apache woman, huh?" His tone carried both curiosity and judgment. Daniel stayed calm. "She works here, helps with the ranch," he said simply. The man laughed. "You sure she's not trouble?" Ayana stood quietly beside the barn, her eyes sharp. Daniel looked straight at the man and said firmly, "She's no trouble. She's the best thing to happen to this place." The trader smirked but didn't argue. When he left, Daniel noticed Ayana looking at him strangely. "You didn't have to say that," she said softly. "It's true," he replied. She didn't answer but turned away, hiding a small, uncertain smile. That evening, when the air turned cool, Ayana brought him a small woven bracelet she had made from horsehair and dried grass. "For luck," she said simply. Daniel looked at it, unsure what to say. "It's beautiful," he finally managed. "Why give it to me?" Ayana looked down. "Because you gave me back my name." Her words struck deep. He didn't ask what she meant, but he understood. She was no longer a nameless captive or someone's property. She was Ayana again. That night, Daniel sat outside watching the stars, the bracelet still in his hand. Ayana stepped out quietly, standing beside him. "The sky is big here," she said softly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It's been empty for a long time." She looked up at the stars, then said, "Not anymore." They stood there for a moment while in silence. The wind moved gently across the fields, and the night felt calm. Daniel realized that somehow, without trying, their two broken lives had begun to fit together like pieces of the same story. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew. Something deep and unspoken had started growing between them, stronger than the fences around the ranch and wider than the desert itself. The next morning began with a strange quiet. The sun rose slowly over the ranch, turning the fields golden, and the air smelled of fresh rain. Daniel walked out of the cabin, expecting to see Ayana near the barn like always, but she wasn't there. For a moment, worry touched his chest. Then he noticed her footprints leading toward the small river behind the house. He followed quietly and found her sitting on a rock, her feet in the water, her hair shining in the sunlight. She looked peaceful, yet something about her face told him her thoughts were heavy. Daniel stood nearby and said softly, "You're up early." She turned slightly and nodded. "Couldn't sleep." "Too many thoughts?" He sat beside her, watching the water move between stones. "What kind of thoughts?" he asked. She took a deep breath and said, "About what comes next. I don't belong here. I should go." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "Go where?" he asked. She looked at him with calm eyes. "There's a reservation 2 days south. Some of my people might be there. Maybe I'll find someone who remembers me." He didn't speak for a long time. The idea of her leaving felt like a hole opening in the quiet life he had begun to rebuild. "If that's what you want, I'll take you there," he said quietly. Ayana turned to him, her eyes soft. "You would do that?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "You deserve a home, a real one." She looked down at the water and said, "You speak like a man who doesn't know he already gave me one." The words caught him off guard. He didn't know what to say. The breeze moved between them, carrying the sound of birds from the fields. After a long pause, Daniel said, "If you still want to go, we'll leave tomorrow. I'll get the horses ready." She didn't answer, only looked away toward the horizon. The rest of the day was quiet. Ayana worked as usual, feeding the animals, fixing tools, and preparing simple food, but she didn't speak much. Daniel noticed it and felt a heaviness settle over the ranch. That night, as he sat by the fire, she came and sat across from him. "Why do you live so far from everyone?" she asked suddenly. Daniel looked into the flames. "People talk too much. Work is simple. Land doesn't lie." She nodded slowly. "You like silence?" He thought for a moment. "I used to. Now I'm not so sure." She met his eyes and the firelight danced between them. "Maybe silence is only good until someone teaches you what you were missing," she said softly. Then she stood up and went to her bed. Daniel stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the fire. Her words felt heavy and true. He realized he didn't want to lose her, not because he pitied her, but because her presence had brought light back into his life. The next morning, Daniel saddled 2 horses. Ayana packed a small bag with a few things, a blanket, dried food, and the woven bracelet she had given him days ago. They rode side by side across the open plains. The sky was wide and clear, the wind cool against their faces. For hours they didn't speak. By noon they stopped to rest under a large tree. Daniel gave her water and said quietly, "If you find your people, I'll leave you there. But if you don't—" He stopped mid-sentence. Ayana looked at him. "Then what?" she asked. Daniel met her eyes. "Then you can come back home with me." She smiled faintly. "Home?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "You really think your ranch is my home?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know, but it feels like mine only when you're there." Ayana looked down, her expression unreadable. Then she said softly, "In my tribe, when a man says that, it means more than he understands." Daniel didn't answer. He just watched her tie her hair back and climb on the horse again. They reached a small settlement by sunset. It was quiet, with only a few tents and smoke rising from fires. Ayana spoke to an older woman in her language. The woman looked sad and shook her head. When Ayana returned, her eyes were distant. "They don't know me," she said. "No one here remembers my family." Daniel saw the pain behind her calm voice. "I'm sorry," he said. She shook her head. "Don't be. It means I can stop searching." She looked at him then, a long, deep look that seemed to reach right through him. "You saved me once. Now let me choose what I want." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer. "I don't want to go anywhere else. I want to stay with you, not as someone you bought, but as someone who stands beside you." He froze, not knowing how to answer. Her voice didn't tremble. It was strong, certain. "You didn't buy me to own me," she continued. "You bought me to save me. That means more than words." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had lived through years of loneliness, but at that moment, he understood what she meant. Her eyes held no fear, only peace. Slowly, he nodded. "Then stay," he said softly. The next morning, they rode back to the ranch. The air was cool and the light golden across the hills. When they reached the porch, Ayana looked around with quiet pride. "This place feels alive," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "It's because you're here." Later that day, Daniel rode into town for supplies. When he returned, he had a different look in his eyes, something calm and decided. Ayana was feeding the chickens when he called her name. "Come here for a moment," he said. She wiped her hands and walked over. He stood beside his horse, holding something small in his hand, a folded piece of paper. "It's from the preacher," he said. "He'll be riding through tomorrow morning." Ayana frowned slightly. "Why?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Because I asked him to stop by." She stared at him for a moment, not understanding. Then realization began to dawn. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "You said you wanted to stay beside me, not as someone owned, but as someone equal. There's only one way to make that true here, to make it so no one can ever question who you are to me." Ayana's eyes widened. "You mean?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "If you'll have me, I'd like you to be my wife." Silence filled the air between them. For a moment, Daniel thought he had said too much. Then Ayana stepped closer, her eyes bright and wet. "You didn't have to ask," she said softly. "You already gave me everything I thought I'd lost." Daniel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "Then tomorrow we'll do it," he said. That night, neither of them spoke much. Ayana cooked while Daniel fixed the old porch light. The air was calm, peaceful, and full of quiet understanding. They didn't need words. The truth was already there between them. As the stars came out, Daniel sat on the steps looking at the wide-open sky. Ayana joined him, sitting close but not touching. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "People might not understand." Daniel looked straight ahead. "I don't need them to," he said. "I just need you." The wind blew gently through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Ayana rested her hand on the wooden step beside his. For the first time in a long, long while, Daniel felt peace deep inside his heart. He had lost everything once, but somehow life had given him something far more precious back. The night before the preacher's arrival was silent and beautiful. The stars above the ranch seemed endless, like witnesses to a promise already written in the quiet hearts of two people who had found each other when they least expected it. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but they both knew one thing for certain. The world had already changed for them, and it would never be the same again. The morning sun broke gently across the sky, painting the horizon with soft gold and pink light. Ayana stood near the window, brushing her long, dark hair, watching the day come alive. Birds flew low across the fields, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Daniel stepped out of the room already dressed in his best, a clean white shirt, a dark vest, and the same old hat he had worn for years. He wasn't used to dressing up, but today was different. He stopped when he saw her. Ayana had taken the old white dress that once belonged to Daniel's late wife and washed it until it looked new. It fit her simply, without any fancy lace or jewelry, but she looked graceful and strong, like she had always belonged in that home. Daniel smiled quietly, his heart full but steady. "The preacher will be here soon," he said softly. Ayana nodded. "I am ready." There was no nervousness in her voice, only calm. She stepped outside barefoot, her feet touching the cool dirt as if it were sacred ground. Daniel followed her out to the porch where everything was still and peaceful. The small wagon appeared on the trail just as the sun climbed higher. The preacher, a kind old man named Reverend Holt, climbed down, tipping his hat. "Morning, Daniel," he said cheerfully. "I hear you've got something important today." Daniel smiled a little. "Yes, sir, I do." The preacher looked at Ayana and nodded politely. "And this must be the lady." Ayana bowed her head slightly, her eyes respectful but calm. There were no guests, no flowers, and no music. Only the sound of wind moving through the grass and the quiet beating of two hearts. Daniel and Ayana stood facing each other near the porch steps while the preacher opened his small book. "Marriage is not about owning or giving," the preacher said slowly, his voice deep and warm. "It is about two people choosing to walk together side by side through the storms and the calm. It is about trust and kindness and the courage to forgive." He looked up at Daniel. "Do you, Daniel Carter, take this woman Ayana to be your wife, to walk with her, protect her, and honor her for all your days?" Daniel's voice was steady. "I do." The preacher turned to Ayana. "And do you, Ayana, take this man Daniel to be your husband, to stand with him, to share his burdens, and to bring peace to his heart as he does to yours?" Ayana looked up at Daniel, her eyes bright with quiet strength. "I do." The preacher smiled gently. "Then by the promise you have spoken before the eyes of heaven and this open land, I declare you husband and wife." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind slowed, the horses in the distance grew still, and the only sound was the heartbeat that seemed to echo in both their chests. Daniel reached for her hand, not in ownership, but in trust. Ayana placed her hand in his without hesitation. They stood like that, two people who had walked through pain and found something real at the end of it. The preacher closed his book and smiled. "You two take care of each other. This land needs more peace like yours." He climbed into his wagon and rode away down the trail, leaving the two of them standing in the sunlight. Daniel turned to her. "Well, Mrs. Carter," he said with a small grin. The words felt both strange and right. Ayana smiled softly. "That name, it feels new," she said, "but it also feels like I've carried it for a long time." They spent the rest of the morning tending to small things around the ranch. Ayana fed the chickens and milked the cow, humming softly to herself. Daniel worked on repairing the water pump, though he kept glancing at her every few minutes, still not quite believing she was really there. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as his wife. When noon came, they shared a meal together. Simple bread, beans, and coffee. Ayana sat across from him, quiet as always, but her eyes spoke warmth and peace. After they finished eating, she stood and said, "Come." Daniel followed her outside, curious. She led him to the small patch of land near the garden where the earth was soft. "I want to plant something," she said, "something that grows strong." She knelt down and dug a small hole with her hands, then dropped in a few seeds she had carried in a small pouch since the day they met. "Corn," she said. "My mother always said it keeps families together." Daniel knelt beside her and helped cover the seeds with soil. Together, they pressed the earth down gently, side by side. As they stood up, Daniel said quietly, "Maybe we can plant more. This land has room." Ayana looked around, her eyes full of thought. "Yes, enough for both of us to grow." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel sat on the porch with his guitar, a dusty old thing that hadn't been touched in years. He began to play softly, awkward at first, then smoother as his hands remembered the rhythm. Ayana stepped outside, wiping her hands on her dress, and leaned against the door frame, listening. The music was simple but full of heart. When he stopped, she said quietly, "You play like someone who remembers how to be alive." He smiled. "Maybe I just needed the right reason." She walked closer and sat beside him. The two of them watched the last light fade from the sky. That night, the ranch felt different. The silence was warm, not lonely. The walls of the cabin seemed to hold stories again. Daniel lay awake for a while, listening to the sound of the night, the rustle of wind, the soft breathing from the other side of the room. For years, he had dreamed of peace, of having someone to share the small things with. Now that dream had quietly come true, not through wealth or luck, but through kindness and courage. In the following weeks, life found a new rhythm. Ayana managed the garden, tended to the animals, and began weaving small baskets that Daniel sold in town. The people who once whispered when he brought her home now nodded respectfully when they passed. Some still looked curious, but Daniel didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that his home was full again, full of laughter, light, and meaning. One evening after a long day, Ayana sat beside him on the porch. The fields glowed under the setting sun, and the world felt endless. She turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about that day in town?" Daniel nodded, "Every day." "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, that day saved my life as much as it saved yours." Ayana smiled gently. "Maybe we both were meant to find each other in that moment. Maybe the earth sent me to you." Daniel looked at her, his heart full. "If that's true, then I'll thank the earth every day." They sat there in silence again, the way they often did. No need for words. The land stretched wide around them, full of promise. Ayana rested her hand on his arm, and the world felt still and safe. As the stars came out and the night grew quiet, the little ranch stood as a symbol of something rare. Love born not from chance or beauty, but from compassion, trust, and shared strength. Daniel had once believed his life would end in silence, but instead he found a voice again. In Ayana's calm presence, in her laughter, and in the way she turned a lonely home into a living heart. And though no one in town ever quite understood how a quiet rancher and a strong Apache woman came to build a life together, those who visited their land could feel it. The peace that comes only when two broken souls finally find where they belong. Sometimes the purest love begins with the simplest act of defiance against cruelty. Daniel didn't ride into town that day looking for a wife. He was only trying to buy nails and rope. But when he saw Ayana standing proud on that auction block, treated like property instead of a person, something inside him refused to stay silent. $40 wasn't the price of a slave. It was the cost of saying, "Not today, not her, not while I'm still breathing." He thought he was just giving her freedom. He never imagined she would end up giving him back his life. Two broken hearts, one emptied by fever, the other by violence, slowly discovered that healing doesn't always come from forgetting the past. Sometimes it comes from sharing it with someone who understands the weight of silence. Day by day, through quiet work, shared meals, and storms faced side by side, they built something the world didn't expect. A home where neither of them had to be alone again. This story reminds us that real love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about seeing someone's worth when everyone else looks away and having the courage to stand in the gap, even when you're not sure what comes next. One act of compassion can rewrite two entire lives. So tell me in the comments, has there ever been a moment when a single act of kindness, given or received, completely changed the direction of your life? I read every single one. If this story warmed your heart even a little, hit subscribe and the bell. Every week, we share real cowboy love stories that prove the human spirit is still the most beautiful thing under these wide western skies. See you in the next one, partner.